Hello and welcome to the finale of Call It Courage. After nearly 2 hours of previous parts, we come to part 7 and we are ready to finish Armstrong Sperry's classic tale of adventure and survival. And we find out what's about to happen to Mafatu. Because, man, in part 6, so much happened. There was the scene with the shark, and then with the wild boar, and with the octopus. He's gained his courage. He feels comfortable on the water. He's ready to go home. He has survived. He has built a canoe. Everything is coming up great for him. But then in the middle of the night, before he was ready to leave back for his home of Hikaru in the morning, something woke him up. And then once he kind of cleared the sleep from his head, he realized it was the sound of drums, and the eaters of men had come back to the island. A chill sweat broke out over Mafatu's body. He crouched there listening, unable for the moment to make a single movement. The rhythmic message that boomed across the mountain brought him a message of doom. Thump, 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 thump. It shivered along his nerves, setting his hair on edge. Warily, moving with utmost caution, Mafatu crept out of the house. The beach was softly brilliant in the light of the waning moon. Any figure moving along the sand he could have seen instantly. He stopped, every nerve strung like a wire. The beach was still deserted, the jungle silent and black with mystery. The boy rose to his feet. Swift as a shadow, he turned into the undergrowth where the trail led to the high plateau. The jungle had never seemed so dark, so ominous with peril. The tormented roots of the mape trees clutched at him. Lianas vines tripped him. Tree ferns, ghostly in the half-light, rustled about him as he passed, their muted hush seeming to say, "Not yet, Mafatu, not yet." By the time he reached the plateau, he was breathless and panting. He dropped to his knees and crawled forward an inch or two at a time. One false move might spell destruction, but he had to know. He had to know. Thump, thump, thump! The measured booming grew louder with every inch that he advanced. Now it pounded in his ears, reverberated through his body, thrummed in his nerves. Somewhere below in darkness, black hands drew forth from hollowed logs a rhythm that was a summation of life, a testament of death. Uri crept close to his master's side, the hair ridging on his neck, his growl drowned in the thunder. Now the boy could see into the cleared circle of the sacred place. Leaping fires lighted a scene that burned itself forever into his memory. Fires blazed against the basalt cliffs, spurts of flame that leapt and danced, showers of sparks borne off the back of the night wind. Now a deep, wild chanting rose above the booming of the drums. From his vantage point, Mafatu saw 6 war canoes drawn up on the beach. Mighty canoes they were, with high curving stems and decorations of white shell that caught the firelight in savage patterns. But what held the boy's eyes in awful trance were the figures, springing and leaping about the flames. Figures black as night's own face, darting, shifting, bounding toward the sky. They were the eaters of men. Firelight glistened on their oiled bodies, on flashing spears and bristling decorations. High above the drum's noise rose the mournful note of the conch shells, an eerie wailing, like the voices of souls lost in interstellar space. Mafatu saw that the savages were armed with ironwood war clubs, clubs studded with shark's teeth or barbed with a stingray's spike. Zigzags of paint streaked their bodies, and towering above all, the great stone idol looked down with sightless eyes, just as it had looked for untold centuries. Mafatu, lying there on the ledge of basalt, watched the strange scene, nearly powerless to move, and he felt doom itself breathing chill upon his neck. He drew back from the edge of the cliff. He must flee. But in that very instant, he heard a crashing in the undergrowth not 20 yards away. A guttural shout ripped the darkness. The boy flung a desperate glance over his shoulder. 4 dark figures were tearing toward him through the jungle. He could see them now. He turned and ran blindly down the trail whence he had come, slipping, sliding, stumbling, his breath all but choking in his throat. He felt like a man drowning in ice-cold water. He felt just as he had sometimes felt in dreams, fleeing on legs that were weighted. Only one thought gave him courage as he ran. His canoe was ready and waiting. His canoe, if only he could reach it in time, shove it into the water before the savages overtook him. Then he would be safe. He knew this trail as he knew the back of his hand. That knowledge gave him an advantage. He could hear his pursuers slipping, stumbling through the brush, shouting threats in a language strange to his ears. But there was no mistaking the meaning behind those words. On the boy dashed, fleet as an animal. Thorns and vines clutched at him. Once he tripped and sprawled headlong, but he was up and away in an instant. Through the trees he caught a glimpse of the white beach, and his heart surged. Then he was speeding across the sand, Uri at his heels. The canoe was at the lagoon's edge. The boy fell upon the thwart, shoved the craft into the water. The logs under the stem rolled easily. In that second, the eaters of men, yelling wildly, broke from the jungle and dashed across the beach. Mafatu was not a minute too soon. He leapt aboard and ran up the sail. The savages rushed after him into the shallows. A gust of wind filled the sail. It drew smartly. Now the men were swimming. One of them in the lead reached out to lay hold of the outrigger. His dark hand clutched the purao pole, and the canoe slacked. Mafatu could see the gleam of bared teeth as he pulled himself up. The boy lifted the paddle and cracked it down. With a groan, the man dropped back into the water. The canoe, now freed from his grasp, skimmed out toward the barrier reef. The savages stopped, turned back toward shore. Then they were running back to the trail that led across the island, shouting to their fellows as they ran. Mafatu knew that it was only a question of minutes until the whole pack would be aroused and in pursuit. But he had the advantage of a head start and a light craft, while their canoes would have to beat around the southern point of the island before they could catch up with him. If only the breeze would hold. Mafatu remembered then that the canoes he had seen drawn up on the beach had not been sailing canoes. There were strong arms to propel those black canoes, to overtake him if they could. Mafatu's canoe, so slim and light, sped like a zephyr across the lagoon. The tide was on the ebb, churning in its race through the passage into the outer ocean. The boy gripped the steering paddle and offered up a prayer. Then he was caught in the riptide. Excuse me. The sail filled as the wind of the open sea rushed to greet him. The outrigger heeled over. Mafatu scrambled to windward to lend his weight for balance, and he was off, homeward. Soon, rising above the reef thunder, the boy could hear a measured sound of savage chanting. They were after him in pursuit. Looking back over his shoulder, he could see the dark shapes of the canoes rounding the southern headland. Moonlight shone on 100 wet paddles as they dipped and rose to the rhythm of the chant. It was too dark to see the eaters of men themselves, but their wild song grew ever more savage as they advanced. The breeze was almost dead aft. The crab-claw sail swelled, smooth and taut, rigid as a block of silver against the sky. The little canoe, so artfully built, ran with swell and favoring wind, laying knots behind her. She was as fleet and graceful as the following gulls. But the eaters of men were strong paddlers with death in their hearts. Their motu tabu, their sacred place, had been profaned by a stranger. Vengeance powered their muscles. They seemed tireless. On and on they came. The wind began to drop. Imperceptibly at first. Sensing it, Mafatu whistled desperately for Maui. "Maui, do not desert me! This last time, lend me your help!" Soon the black canoes were so close the boy could see the shine of dark bodies, the glint of teeth, and flash of ornament. If the wind died, so would he. Closer and closer the canoes advanced. There were 6 of them, filled each with 10 warriors. Some of them leapt to their feet, brandished their clubs, shouted at the boy across the water. They were a sight to quake even the stoutest heart. With every second they were cutting down the distance which separated their canoes from Mafatu's. Then the wind freshened, just a puff, but enough. Under its impetus, the little canoe skimmed ahead while the boy's heart gave an upward surge of thanks. Maui had heard his prayer and answered. Day broke over the wide Pacific. There were the 6 black canoes, paddles flashing, now gaining, now losing. The boy was employing every art and wile of sailing that he knew. As long as the wind held, he was safe. He managed his little craft to perfection, drawing from it every grace of speed in flight. He knew that with coming night the wind might drop. And then he forced the thought from his mind. If the wind deserted him, it would mean that Maui had deserted him too. But the savages would never get him. It would be Moana the sea god's turn. The boy looked down into the blue depths overside, and his smile was grim. "Not yet, Moana," he muttered fiercely. "You haven't won. Not yet." But with falling night, the wind still held. Darkness rose up from the sea, enveloping the world. The stars came out, clear and bright. The boy searched among them for some familiar constellation to steer by. Should it be Mataiki, Little Eyes? Would Mataiki lead him back safely to Hikaru? And then he saw, and knew. There blazing bravely were the 3 stars of the fishhook of Maui. Maui, his sign. Those were his stars to steer by. They would surely lead him home. In that moment, he was aware that the chanting of his pursuers had become fainter, steadily diminishing. At first, he could not believe it. He listened intently. Yes, there was no doubt about it now. As the breeze freshened, the sound grew fainter each passing moment. The boy quenched his thirst, ate a scrap of poi, fought against sleep as the night waxed and waned. By daybreak, the chanting had ceased altogether. There was no sign of the canoes upon the broad expanse of the sea. The sunburst marched across the swinging waters. Far off, an albatross caught its light of gold on its wings. Was it Kiwi? Mafatu could not tell. The wind held fresh and fair. The high island had vanished over the curve of the sea, and the eaters of men had turned back. But now the great ocean current that had carried Mafatu so willingly away from Hikaru was dead set against him. He put his little craft first on one tack, then on another, and as the long hours passed, it seemed as if he were making no headway at all, even though the canoe still cut smartly through the water. There was a drift and pull that appeared to make a forward gain impossible. Was it Moana, the implacable one, trying to prevent Mafatu from returning to his homeland? Perhaps, the boy thought wearily, Maui is not yet ready for me to return. Is there still a shadow of fear in my heart? Is that it? He was tired now in every nerve and sinew, tired in the marrow of his bones, tired of struggle. The long hours passed slowly while the sun climbed. Mafatu lashed the steering paddle and slept fitfully. Uri lay in the shadow of the sail. The sun sank in a conflagration like the death of a world. Night came and fled. Dawn rose in a burst of flame, and still Mafatu's canoe skimmed across the sea currents, now on this tack, now on that. He was to learn in the hours to come that all days, all time would be like that. Hours upon hours of blasting heat, of shattering sunlight, followed by nights of fitful respite and uneasy sleep. Only the sea and the sky, the sea and the sky. A bird now and then, a fish leaping from the sea, a boy in a frail canoe. That was all. As one day dragged into another, Mafatu scanned the heavens for some hint of rain. Storm! Anything would have been a welcome relief to this blasting monotony, to this limitless circle of sea. His store of food diminished and vanished. The coconuts likewise. His water was being guarded drop by drop. But there would come a moment when the last drop must be taken. And then... The season of storm was long past. The days, as they came, were cloudless and untroubled. Each day broke like a clap of thunder, and night fell softly as a footfall. The sea was sparkling and benign. The sun's rays were unbroken in their violence. At night the fishhook of Maui twinkled down like friendly eyes, luring Mafatu on, and torchfishes darted up from the lower depths, while the black waters gleamed with strange lights. Then gradually, as the canoe entered some other current of the sea, the wind slackened and diminished. This wind that had blown him on for so long. Now the sail began to slat and bang in the dead air. The canoe drifted on the slow, majestic tide. The ceaseless heave and surge of the sea's dark chest lulled the boy to a half-sleeping rest. The murmur of the waters playing about the prow sounded like his mother's reassuring voice. Each sun as it rose seemed hotter than that of the preceding day. Now the face of the ocean was like a disk of blazing copper. Masses of seaweed heavy with the eggs of fishes floated on the sluggish tide, seeming to clutch at the canoe, to hold it back from its destination. Hikaru, the cloud of islands, did they really exist? Were they not, like the chambered nautilus, only an iridescence dreamed by the sea? Sharks were beginning to appear, as they did always about a craft becalmed. One dorsal fin, larger than the others, followed the canoe in leisurely parallel, just far enough distant so that Mafatu could not see the body that supported it. but he knew from the size of the dorsal that it must be a tiger shark. It began at length to play upon his nerves and set him jumpy. He scarcely dared now at night to even lash his steering paddle in sleep. The sail slatted and banged. The boy paddled through the long hours, paddled until the muscles of his arms and shoulders ached in agony and every sinew cried out in protest. And at night, when darkness brought blessed release from the sun, there was always the fishhook of Maui leading him on. But now when the boy looked up at the ancient constellation, doubt lay heavy on his heart. Hikaru, where was it? Where was it? The sea gave back no answer. Maui, the boy whispered, have you deserted me? Have you looked into my heart and found me wanting? And suddenly, like the snapping of a string, he was overwhelmed with despair. Maui had deserted him. It was Moana the sea god's turn. The sea looked dark and cool and inviting. Little wavelets lapped and chuckled about the hull like beckoning hands. He looked overside. Deep down in those cool depths, it seemed to him that he could see faces. His mother's, perhaps. He dashed his hands across his eyes. Had the sun stricken him daft? Had he been touched by moon madness? Then a wave of overpowering anger brought him to his knees. Anger at this dark element, this sea which would destroy him if it could. His voice was thick and hoarse, his throat bursting with rage. Moana, you sea god! He shouted violently. You destroyed my mother. Always you have tried to destroy me. Fear of you has haunted my sleep. Fear of you turned my people against me. But now, he choked, his hands gripped his throat to stop its hot burning. Now I no longer fear you, sea. His voice rose to a wild note. He sprang to his feet, flung back his head, spread wide his arms in defiance. Do you hear me, Moana? I am not afraid of you. Destroy me if you must, but I laugh at you. Do you hear? I laugh. His voice cracked but triumphant shattered the dead air. He sank back on his haunches, shaking with spasms of ragged laughter. It racked his body, left him spent and gasping on the floor of the canoe. Uri, whimpering softly, crept to his master's side. Off to the northeast, a haze of light glowed up from the sea. Sometimes the lagoon of an atoll throws up just such a glow. It is the reflection of the lagoon upon the lower sky. Lifting his head, the boy watched it with dulled eyes, not comprehending at first. Temori, he whispered at last, his voice a thread of awe. The lagoon fire. There came a whir and fury in the sky above, a beat of mighty wings. An albatross edged with light circled above the canoe. It swooped low. Its gentle, questing eyes turned upon the boy and his dog. Then the bird lifted in its effortless flight, flew straight ahead and vanished into the lagoon fire. And then Mafatu knew. This was Hikaru. His homeland lay ahead. Kiwi. A strangled cry broke from the boy. He shut his eyes tight, and there was a taste of salt wet upon his lips. The crowd assembled upon the beach watched the small canoe slip through the reef passage. It was a fine canoe, artfully built. The people thought at first that it was empty, though. Silence gripped them, and a chill of awe touched them like a cold hand. Then they saw a head lift above the gunwale. A thin body struggled to sit upright, clinging to the mid-thwart. Ai te awe! The cry went up from the people in a vast sigh, so they might speak if the sea should give up its dead. But the boy who dropped overside into the shallows and staggered up the beach was living flesh and blood, albeit wasted and thin. They saw that a necklace of boar's teeth shone upon his chest. A splendid spear flashed in his hand. Te Vananui, the great chief of Hikaru, went forward to greet the stranger. The brave young figure halted, drew itself upright. "My father," Mafatu cried thickly. "I have come home." The great chief's face was transformed with joy. This brave figure, so thin and straight, with the fine necklace and the flashing spear, and courage blazing from his eyes, was his son? The man could only stand and stare, as if he could not believe his senses. And then a small yellow dog pulled himself over the gunwale of the canoe and fell at his master's feet. Uri. Far overhead, an albatross caught a light of gold on its wings. Kiwi. Then Tavananui turned to his people and cried out, "Here is my son, come home from the sea. Mafatu, Stoutheart, a brave name for a brave boy." Mafatu swayed where he stood. "My father, Tavananui caught his son as he fell. It happened many years ago, before the traders and missionaries first came into the South Seas, while the Polynesians were still great in numbers and fierce of heart. But even today, the people of Hikaru sing this story in their chants and tell it over the evening fires. And what an interesting way that Armstrong Sperry wraps up that book. If you go back to part 1, the final paragraph here at the end of the book is nearly identical to the opening paragraph of the story. So a nice little bookend, almost like the rhyming of a poem. And so that concludes Armstrong Sperry's classic tale, Call It Courage, as Mafatu did indeed survive. What a horrific couple of months he had, all of the challenges that he had to overcome, but he did it. And if you are someone that has followed along with Number the Stars, and if you haven't, check that out in one of our other playlists on our channel, that was another story that dealt with courage, where when Anne-Marie in that story, a young girl who dealt with some difficult circumstances of her own, was speaking with her uncle, no spoilers, and she mentioned that she didn't feel very brave because what she had done, she was so scared as she was doing it. But her uncle rightly told her, that's what bravery is. That's what courage is. You might be afraid, but you do it anyway. And that's really what Mafatu did throughout this story. He was afraid to leave Hikaru and face the ocean. He did it anyway. He was afraid to try and survive on his own. He did it anyway. He was afraid to touch that statue at the sacred place of the Eaters of Men to get the spearhead. He did it anyway. He was afraid to face the shark, the wild boar, the octopus, the Eaters of Men themselves, and he did it all. He faced down Moana the sea god again in his journey home. And all of these things, while he might have felt fear, he fought through it and did it anyway. And that is exactly what courage is about. So if you ever have those times in your life where you might be afraid or things feel like they're too tough, just know that you can overcome that, and that's what bravery really is. Bravery isn't the absence of fear. Bravery is you might be afraid, but you fight through it anyway. And so hopefully that's a lesson that you can take from this tale, a personal favorite of mine, and one that I showed you in that opening book that I had read in my own time as a 5th grader. And hopefully you enjoyed it, and you'll join us back for more Read Aloud fun with other stories. Bye.